Thanks, Liz. It's great to be here. So I'm here to talk about making innovation accessible. And so when I'm talking about innovation, I'm largely talking about sort of the way that we approach it, which is around immersive media projects. At ITVS, as Liz was alluding, our goal is to tell untold stories about underrepresented communities and to bring them into a public interest dialogue around various social issues, which is what the heart of what we do. Everything what we do at ITVS is around diversity and innovation. So that's the core of all of our work. So that is traditionally social issue documentaries, but is increasingly inclusive of digital series and immersive media projects. And so again, the goal is to bring diverse and disenfranchised communities into the discourse around specific social issues. When we're looking at that, one of the things that we have to confront is that sadly, innovative technology or even story is not necessarily on its own going to be able to do that. Many interactive media projects right now are reaching largely only a niche audience, particularly in the US, because while they're designed to be beautiful and artistic and engaging, they're not necessarily the most accessible to the communities that we're trying to bring into this discourse around the story and the subject matter. So one of the things that we have to be aware of is that the average online consumer is still wanting a lean back experience. So that's not necessarily sort of a popular opinion here, but it's one of the realities that, particularly in the US, that we really have to face. And so what I'm here to talk about is how do you design for both user groups? How do you really present an innovative and immersive media project in a way that also has a lean back experience that will attract the audience that you're trying to attract? So Liz gave a great introduction to what we do at ITVS, but I can talk a little bit more about it. And this is just a diagram I like to show when we talk about sort of what we do at ITVS and the way that we fund content. So largely, as I said, we're a funder and distributor of urgent stories of consequence for public media. And so it's really important for us to try and put that content in as many different places as possible. So these are some of the places that we try to place that content, even though largely what we're doing is funding for public television or public media platforms online. So the goal is always for us to use that diverse content strategy to maximize a really diverse impact strategy and create as many impact points as possible. So our digital strategy is a really big piece of that. And historically, we've funded and distributed digital projects in a lot of different forms in a lot of different ways. And so that goes from interactive docs to games to apps to different kinds of shorts. And largely they were projects that were, for the most part, connected to a long-form broadcast documentary on PBS. That's not always the case, but that's largely what we would try and do to create new access points for public television traditionally within the digital space. As time evolved, we weren't necessarily always trying to draw people to television. A lot of times it was more about creating a two-way communication. Because a lot of your audiences are not necessarily going to make that jump. They may consume something in the digital space, but have no interest in going to public television per se to see something that's connected to it. So a lot of times what we're doing also is taking public television related content or themes or public interest programming and trying to sort of morph it to a digital audience so that we can place the content in a different place, even if the program itself is not in a different place. One of the other things that we started doing, particularly around 7 or 8 years ago, is really thinking about how do we expand innovation to also include genre. Unfortunately, in the US, the public television programming is relatively narrow and doesn't experiment with genre as much as public television in Europe and in Asia as well. But for us, one of the things we started doing is really thinking about how do we explore genre programming as a way to further the kinds of discourse that we're trying to have with underrepresented communities, which are largely communities of color in the US around content. And so experimenting with things like science fiction was a way that we did that when we first started the FUTURESTATES series, which was originally conceived as an anthology series of science fiction shorts for web distribution. So pretty straightforward in terms of its form, but again, for public television in the US, doing something that's specifically designed for the web as a web series was actually quite innovative at the time, around 8 years ago. So we had some great success with this project, and we've done 5 seasons of it now. And after the first couple of years, we started to notice interest was maybe waning a little bit. So one of the things that we had to do was really think about how do we sort of innovate within this brand, keeping in mind that it was a great strategy for us to work with a diverse body of filmmakers and engage with a diverse audience group the way that we wanted to, but how do we keep it fresh, right? Because after 3 years or so, and you're saying, well, here are 10 more films from 10 more filmmakers about the not too distant future, which is what this was about. It's sort of futuristic scenarios through a sci-fi lens around specific social issues. How do you refresh that concept in a way that is going to be attractive and engaging to the groups that you're trying to draw? So one of the things that we did was start experimenting with bringing more interactive projects into that brand. So this is Vision Machine, and this is an interactive animated motion comic specifically designed for the iPad that we funded within the FUTURESTATES brand. And the idea was to sort of take that brand to new audiences and new places. And so this allowed us to really reach out to audiences at like, you know, San Diego and New York Comic-Con, right? Which is an audience that is like by no means watching public television. So it's a great way for us to reach out to new groups and get them to kind of engage in that discourse. This particular project is about the future of communications technology. So we created this connected motion comic, which really kind of broke some boundaries in some interesting ways beyond even what some of the commercial people were doing in this space. So it was a great way for us to experiment with that. One of the other things that we did was Wish for the Future, which was created by Lance, who is now probably winning the award for most mentions in all presentations throughout the course of the day. So maybe all the other speakers can find ways to work Lance into their presentations too. But this is a project that we funded and worked with Lance to create, which is a participatory storytelling project to get a wide variety of groups involved in design thinking to imagine how to make a better future. And this is, again, a great way for us to sort of place the brand of FUTURESTATES and place kind of social issue thinking about the future into a lot of different places. So after about 4 years or so, this is kind of what we were doing. And you know, we had these short films here, we had these interactive projects here, and one of the things that I in particular was really interested in doing is saying, how do we bring these two things together, right? If we're continuing to try and innovate within this brand, you know, how do we just kind of move beyond having these two separate pieces, but really do something that expands the way that stories are told and really allow public media to be very participatory in a new way. So one of the things that we were really thinking is, you know, how do we innovate a whole new kind of web series and create something that is going to be stickier, to engage our audiences more, something that's going to be really truly interactive and user-driven, where you could potentially control the experience of the story and ideally have a different experience every time you visit. So what we did is we convened a group of 7 independent filmmakers and a team of interactive designers and storytellers to really reboot the entire series concept. So the idea was to really, you know, create an immersive story world with a lot of different offshoots and threads that go into different places. So, you know, what we tried to do is have 7 independent, distinct stories, but then also have, you know, the user experience and the UI of the website itself also tell a story, trying to have, instead of, you know, things like trailers for short films, which nobody watches anyway, you know, how do you create shareable media content that makes the story world that much more spreadable? How do you, you know, create a narrative within social media for a property like this? And things like that. So that was the goal, and ultimately what it got us to is this complete reboot of the project. And so just earlier this year, we relaunched FUTURESTATES as this kind of immersive media series. And I can show you sort of a quick look of what that looks like. So this is just kind of a basic walkthrough of the site, and you know, you get there and you have a few introductory moments that kind of help frame the experience. But the idea was to really have this sort of visual manifestation of a story world whose visual design is revealed to you to have purpose the more content you consume, but in a way that's such that you can explore it on your own, right? With minimal instruction, just to kind of go there and start clicking. And we had some really interesting lessons that popped up during the course of the construction of this particular environment, some of which I can share with you guys, and I hope it's instructive for those of you guys that are creators here. So it's interesting because we wanted to have this very immersive, kind of user-driven experience. And as much as our instinct, certainly my instinct, was just to kind of like drop you into the interface, one of the things that was really important for us, given that this was really new territory for us and, you know, arguably for web series as a genre in general, was to really conduct a lot of user testing early and make sure that we have the correct level of framing such that when you get here, you're not just like totally turned off by the experience and just click away. So it became clear that we really needed to have some level of framing in order to to teach audiences how to pilot the thing. And I think that that's a really important thing for interactive producers to consider, is like every time you're creating sort of a new innovative experience that tells a story in a different way, you also have to really keep in mind, how are you teaching your user to actually pilot that project? Because if they don't understand it, and if it's not immediately 100% within their wheelhouse in terms of the story, it's really, really easy to turn off of that, particularly if you're coming at it from an experience of like, I'm used to a lean back experience. That's something to really keep in mind. Another thing to really keep in mind about this particular project, and one of the ways that we really made it accessible, is that there's a whole narrative on top of this that played out specifically on Twitter to a large degree, and to a lesser degree on Tumblr. And that's one of the real critical ways that we were able to draw people to the experience, but also sort of have the experience exist in a place that isn't this distinct URL, which, even though it's been a brand for 5 years, you know, people may not necessarily, in fact, I guarantee they're not visiting the Future States site on a regular basis. So we have to kind of keep that alive and draw people to it, and also frame the experience in a way that they understand that they're about to experience something different from what they've experienced for the last 4 years. But one of the things that it was important for us to do in that kind of social media narrative is really to create a narrative, to really give the narrative purpose, have reasons for this story within social media to be interacting with different people, and to really hardwire it into the story. So it's really integral part of the experience. So a lot of the things that we were trying to do was really just kind of create this cohesive world to make it stickier, use shareable media to create new access points, and also really integrate that community discussion into the narrative in a certain way. So getting back to kind of the big theme of this whole talk is accessibility, right? So, you know, this we felt was really, really innovative, but is it accessible? And I think the answer is yes, eventually. There are definitely some lessons that we learned through this process. One of the things, as you saw through the walkthrough, there's this basic sort of menu bar on the side that you can pop out whenever you need to. And that was something that, you know, took a lot of discussion. It was something that became really, really important for the experience, which is, you know, my instinct in doing something like this with our collaborators, you know, my instinct was, well, let's just drop them in and have them sort of have to figure things out. But, you know, when we were user testing and got response that was sort of contradictory to that we needed some kind of framing, you know, the initial response is just to kind of say, well, this is how we wanted to design it, and, you know, you should be forced to go through this experience. But that's exactly the opposite of the way that we need to be thinking about these projects, right? Everything that we do is all about the user, right? You have to think about accessibility, and so you have to present the project in a way that the audience wants to have it presented to them. So, you know, that's one of the main important things to consider. You know, the other lesson about something like this is that, you know, there's a lot of content here. There's like 2 hours of content, maybe more than that. And so you have to be okay with people not necessarily wanting to interact with the whole thing. So how do you make pieces of this integrated whole compelling, but also how do you incentivize doing a deeper dive with that? And so it's about really making sure that each piece of the story tells its own story as well. So each of those little nodes is a complete beginning to end story, but if you are motivated to go from another piece to another piece, then you have a deeper understanding of the world and how we got to this particular story world. You know, the other thing I'll just bring up that I think a lot of times we take for granted is that you have to really understand the audience implication of using a specific technology. This is something I alluded to a little bit earlier, but, you know, a lot of these projects that are really innovative and require cutting edge technology, you know, you definitely have to keep in mind, like, who is the audience you're trying to reach and how are they consuming this stuff? You know, we're trying to reach out to an audience that maybe isn't necessarily very tech savvy, and so maybe they don't update their browsers that often. And so it's really important to consider that when you're doing something that really requires the latest version of your browser. When we first launched this thing and we started to see, you know, the hits on the browser unsupported page starting to climb, you know, we had to react really, really quickly to make sure that we were creating an alternative version of the experience that still gave people, you know, a sense of what this was and to be able to access the content without forcing them to go through and update their browsers, which, you know, if they don't do it on a regular basis, which a lot of people don't, in fact, I don't, it's not a natural thing to do. I think it's also important to consider, you know, being really limited in, or not limited, but judicious in the way that you think about what are the interaction principles of your project, which was something that we really had to think about. Believe it or not, we actually scaled this way back. I mean, one of the things that we wanted to do was add in a little bit more functionality and more ways to interact with it. But this in and of itself, was sufficient. It's actually more than sufficient. There are a lot of people that, consume only a few pieces of content and then dip back out. And so you need to be sort of aware of, what is the threshold for interaction of a specific community based on what your target audience is. And then lastly, like really creating access points where your users are. That was another really big lesson for us in terms of making the media as shareable as possible. Which is why we had this sort of whole narrative playing out on Tumblr and Twitter, and a lot of this content was syndicated out on YouTube with click-throughs to go to the full immersive experience. So there are a few things that this experience taught us that influenced our strategies moving forward. This last one, too, about going to where your users are is a really important one. We'd internally at ITVS, as a public media organization, talked about, what is the viability of something like YouTube as a public media platform? You can consume content on our PBS site, on pbs.org, but it may not necessarily be, in fact, it definitely isn't the same kind of content destination that YouTube is. And so how do you bring public interest, public media programming to that community, which is populated with exactly the kind of community that we're trying to reach out to, younger audiences, audiences of color that aren't necessarily watching public television. So coincidentally, on the other side of the office, we were incubating another project which was testing that very same thing. So this is a project called Everything But the News, which is a pretty straightforward digital series, but it's innovative for public media in that it's kind of a mashup of comedy and tech journalism, specifically in the San Francisco Bay Area. It's a co-production between ITVS and PBS Digital Studios, which is a PBS YouTube channel. It's different than the pbs.org page, and this is sort of trying to create PBS-related content while pushing the brand a little bit that specifically reaches out to the YouTube audience. So, this was kind of a pilot program that we launched earlier this year. And, it was really interesting thinking about this, what would like an ITVS portfolio on PBS Digital Studios look like? Because it's a great platform, has a great subscriber base, reaches exactly who we're trying to reach, but isn't necessarily creating programming that is reaching out to diverse audiences the way that we try to at ITVS, and isn't necessarily as innovative in terms of the style of storytelling and the way that you're engaging viewers in a dialogue in an immersive way. So this is a great fit, right? I mean, those two things, diversity and innovation, right within ITVS's wheelhouse. So, one of the things that we started doing is piloting a program with immersive media projects designed specifically for this kind of distribution on YouTube in a way that reaches the audience that we tried to reach. So that program is the ITVS Storylab. So what this is it's a digital series incubator that used mainly a TV development pilot model, but we crossed it with very decisive and surgical instances of rapid prototyping, because all of these projects were designed to be very immersive and interactive with the audience. So taking some of the lessons we learned from FUTURESTATES, combining our burgeoning partnership with PBS Digital Studios, we created this slate of projects, all designed around social issues, built on a smaller scale than FUTURESTATES, and in an iterative fashion to help us engage with viewers sooner and iterate content over time. Because FUTURESTATES is really a long haul. It took us, to do this last iteration of it. It's basically soup to nuts, like an 18-month cycle, which is a long time to be working on a project designed for digital that you want to really be engaging with viewers with. So our approach was to really look at each of these series projects that we funded in a way that could both lean forward and lean back. Again, trying to design for both user groups, make sure that we're not punishing anyone for wanting to have a more traditional viewing experience. But if you wanted to do a deeper dive, you could do that by going and linking out to an immersive URL, or in some cases, just being on the social platform where the series lives. So we funded basically 4 projects to do this, and one, here's what we developed. I mean, one is a gamified series about sort of a makeshift utopia. Another deals with the family's experience with foreclosure and its ramifications, played out entirely on Facebook. One consists of interwoven fictional narratives and a crowdsourced documentary that's set entirely in East Detroit. And then the last one is a multi-director iterative series specifically about recidivism that's based on an exquisite corpse model. So a wide sort of variety of different interaction principles, but trying to keep it really basic and making sure that each one is syndicated on platforms in a way that allows you to have a linear experience if you want. But if you are motivated to do a deeper dive with these series, which we hope that you would be, you have that option as well. So they all work as both a lean forward and lean back experience as a way to create accessibility. So a couple of things just, arising from these experiences that we had sort of working with immersive media projects and trying to appeal to viewers and users that aren't necessarily already consuming this kind of content. The main thing that really just comes out of this is that your distribution strategy is really critical. And I think that a lot of people really sort of approach the content as sort of a separate piece from distribution, but one of the things that we were thinking about in our approach to this is, really thinking about the audience first and sort of backtracking it from who are you trying to reach, how does that inform the format and platform for what your project is about, and then how does that inform the way that the story is told, and really trying to think about all of those things in concert with each other. If you build it, they will come approach to this kind of work is dead, basically, because there's so many different types of immersive and interactive digital projects that are being created these days that doing something in the digital space in and of itself is no longer innovative enough to get attention. So you really have to think about what is your distribution strategy and how are you reaching out to those folks. Sadly, there are no traditional distributors for this kind of work. So it's really important to think about who are your partnerships, what are the platforms that you're reaching out to folks on, who are your press partnerships and existing audience bases. All of that stuff is great. And also thinking about, where do you create a presence for this kind of project where the users already are. And then just thinking about designing for your constituents from the ground up, not just from a user experience or a UI standpoint, but dialing it all the way back to story, and really designing story in a way that is geared specifically for your particular audience. That also involves, if you're trying to get people to go from one place to another, really thinking about, what are those sort of necessary plot points that you're using in your content to motivate someone to go from one platform to another, because it has to be really compelling to make that jump. So, the main lessons that we really had as going through these projects are that innovation is always an amazing tool, particularly technological innovation, as well as new story forms, but it's really, really important to think about how do you make these things accessible, right? And good. It's got to be good, too. Thanks.